There are many relevant political issues that have taken center stage over the past couple of weeks and even past couple of months. Erin O'Toole is now out as leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, and while Candice Bergen is the interim leader, the party will still need to choose a permanent leader, and they've already set out the rules as to what that leadership race will look like, as well as the ongoing crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Joining me now to discuss some of the latest political developments on both of those two crises is Tim Powers from Summa Strategies and Stephanie Levitz from the Toronto Star. I want to start out on the Conservative Party and its leadership race. Stephanie, you've been covering this very heavily. You've written numerous articles on it. But perhaps I can just start out with, obviously, we're hearing a lot about people who, may be running for the potential leadership of the party. Obviously, Pierre Poilievre is the only candidate to have, officially declared his candidacy, but there's other indicators as to, what other candidates may be running, even based off of some of the things they've been posting on social media. What are some of the indicators that, you've seen as to that have indicated whether or not someone, is going to run?
There's a couple of things at play, right? In every leadership race, you have what I would refer to maybe as proxies. So those are the folks that go out and they start talking about people. You get names whispered in your ear. Hey, if you're writing about the leadership race, I think you should just throw this name in the mix. And, that's something that happens. And then there's also the folks who just, don't hide it. Jean Charest would be a great example. I mean, he holds a reception at the Chateau Laurier to meet members of parliament. The media there was saying, hey, are you going to run? And he cracks some joke about where to. And, it's a bit of political theater that surrounds all of this stuff. And so you have those parts of it. And you also have to understand, I think, that there are two types of candidate in a leadership race. There are the people who are running to win and to become eventually prime minister. Then there are the people who are running to raise their profile. They have a different game they're trying to play. Perhaps one day they'd like to have a seat as a member of parliament. They'd like to perhaps be a cabinet minister. They don't necessarily want to be prime minister. That's not the end goal. And I think you saw a lot of that in the 2017 leadership race for the Conservative Party, where, you had at one point 15 candidates on the ballot. They had a pretty low entry fee in relative terms. And that's one of the reasons the fee now, 200 grand to enter, 100 grand for you get a refundable deposit. It's one of the reasons they set it so high, is to discourage that. But don't underestimate the deep pockets of folks who think that they can make a large political career out of, starting with a run for the federal leadership.
Tim, there's numerous things that Stephanie mentioned that I'd like to get your insight on, but I want to go back to the point that she mentioned as to some people are kind of playing political theater around it, whereas to, they're trying to hide it, even though it may be leaked somewhere. And then there's some people who just, make jokes about it and who, basically say that they're going to run without officially saying it. I mean, Dr. Leslyn Lewis is an example of that, obviously former 2020 leadership candidate. But if you look at her Twitter feed right now, she's liked numerous posts on her Twitter that have featured articles that said she was going to run. Just, I guess, what's your general take on how various people have, approached announcing that they're going to run? And obviously, some people seem to be doing it officially, while others seem to be doing it unofficially, as I just mentioned with Dr. Leslyn Lewis.
Well, Wyatt, I'll give you a great example from the Liberal Party, and Steph will know this one very well. Frank McKenna, the former Premier of New Brunswick, was the best Liberal Prime Minister the Liberals never had. For decades, Frank McKenna was rumored to be running for the Liberal leadership when Mr. Martin ran and after Mr. Martin lost, and all that was part of an exercise. And Mr. McKenna is an established individual anyway. Never hurts to have your name mentioned as a leadership candidate. I think most people view that. I think in Dr. Lewis's case, she probably will run. I don't know what Steph is hearing today, but certainly the suggestion earlier was that she, and if not she, somebody else from the social conservative wing, if there is a wing of the Conservative Party, will enter. So a lot of this is a phony war right now. The challenge with the phony war is if you're Pierre Poilievre, the perceived front runner, you probably hope the field is smaller, because not unlike Peter MacKay in the 2020 leadership, Mr. Poilievre's calculation, I think, is to try and win this on the first ballot. Because if you don't, then you get into this big stew of outcomes and potentials that don't necessarily favor you, as Peter MacKay discovered. So that's also why you see other people putting their hands up. Leslyn Lewis arguably helped herself in the last leadership campaign by becoming the darling of the race and lending her support in part to Aaron O'Toole in the end, that helped him win. So she may look to position herself again as a power broker. There will be others. You hear the name of Scott Aitkenson, an MP, a former mayor of Parry Sound, Muskoka, who's put his hand up. You may or may not see Patrick Brown. Different people, different reasons, as Steph have alluded to, all with different agendas. Probably 3 of the people we've mentioned so far have a legitimate shot at winning. The rest don't.
And there's also, the question like Tim raises, right? You can only run and lose so many times.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so for somebody like Dr. Lewis, there has to be the calculus. Is this winnable? Is her path to victory? How well she did in 2020 was a bit of a shock, and she capitalized very much on a group of voters in the party that, quite frankly, didn't like Peter MacKay, and they didn't like Aaron O'Toole either. Mm-hmm. They weren't so jazzed about Aaron, and they were looking for, someone that they felt was much more conservative in their principles and their values than either Aaron or Peter, and they gravitated towards Leslyn. That constituency right now, anyway, very much belongs to Pierre Poilievre. And so can Leslyn achieve the same or better than she did in 2020? I'm not sure.
And so then, Steph, in terms of Leslyn Lewis running, just based off of what you mentioned, you can only run and lose so many times. Leslyn Lewis ran in 2020, and obviously she did much better than she was expected to do. And, rumors are saying that she's going to perhaps put her hat in the ring again to run. In terms of, would it not be better for someone like her to maybe wait a little bit longer in terms of, maybe she has cabinet experience if Pierre Poilievre is elected and forms government? Do you think that she's thinking about those types of things?
I'm sure she's taking that all into consideration, right? And playing, she's got to, I would presume, have some kind of long game she's willing to play here, some eye on her prize. If it's not to become prime minister, then it is certainly to become, a cabinet minister for X portfolio, and continue to be the voice for, social conservative values and ideals that she feels and a constituency of the party feels need more representation and more support at the federal level. And it could very well be that could be enough. To be the voice could very well be enough. And she won't damage her credibility by running and losing for a second time. It's just that you have to consider, why is she running? What does she want to do? Her people will say, and they've said to me and said to others, we're in it to win it. There's a path to victory. Everyone is going to say that, of course. But, much like in 2020, well, not much like, I should say, Leslyn is a known this time around.
Yes,
in 2020, she was an unknown. She really, truly was an unknown. There was a pocket of the party that knew her well. There was a pocket of the party where she had come from. She was, one of the people introduced to conservative politics by Jason Kenney, a kingmaker in his own right, and some other different factions or voices, I want to say, that have a lot of power in the movement. I'm certain they will back her again, but she now has not much of a record per se, and some of that was Aaron O'Toole's doing. He pushed her literally right out of the camera, but she does have a record. People will be wondering, well, where were you when caucus was talking about this issue? Where did you stand? How come you didn't come out against vaccine mandates? How come you didn't stand with the truckers? How come you didn't? She'll have some things to answer for, and so it makes her candidacy different this time around as well.
And Tim, before we go on to Russia and Ukraine, I want to ask you about some of the leadership rules that were set out. I've heard reasons that Jean Charest didn't run in 2020 was based off of he was nervous that he wouldn't have had enough time to sell memberships. Obviously, there's other reasons that I'm sure came into play for him. But given that, September 10th is the leadership deadline, that is, a fairly short leadership race. It's not, some people wanted it to be even shorter. Do you think people like Jean Charest and perhaps other people who are looking at, potentially running in the leadership race, do you think that they will look at the leadership race being held on September 10th as something that could set them back if they decide to run?
Pierre Poilievre might view it that way. I think the more important date right now, Wyatt, is the date when membership sales close, and that's June 3rd, if I remember correctly. So what are we today? The 7th of March. So 3 months basically to sell memberships. That right now is probably to Pierre Poilievre's advantage. Jean Charest, who appears, barring some crazy setback this week that he's going to announce, I think it's Thursday, will look to use those 3 months to sell the hell out of Quebec Atlantic Canada and elsewhere to try and succeed. So that 3-month period is the most important. Now, where it may benefit the extra 2 months or 3 months of campaigning, then June, July, and August, that a lot of that campaigning will depend on where people think they are or know they are in membership sales. If there is a closeness in membership sales, because of course the conservative system is 100 points a riding over the 338 ridings, that's how it works, split it proportionally. If there's a closeness, then there may be less firing upon the two that are close between those two, but greater firing among the others. So watch for all of that dynamic. I think a longer campaign is always more dangerous for the front runner. In this case, Mr. Poilievre. The other thing to know about Mr. Charest, despite all his incredible political talents, is he's rusty. He hasn't been in the political arena for a long time. So he can kind of go to ground almost until the end of May, early June, as his people sell the memberships, but he's going to have to perform at some point. So having more time is good for him. And if Patrick Brown enters this race, which I think tonight is a bit of an unknown, having some more time for him to sell memberships. And of the three that we've talked about, the big three, as I will call them, Poilievre, Charest, and Brown, Brown may be the best organizer, but still has a bit of a late start should he enter, because Poilievre will have all the current data. So June 3rd is really key, Wyatt. And then what happens over the summer will give us an indication of who sits where with membership sales.
And in terms of this, will I guess be a good question to lead us into Russia and Ukraine as well. I mean, obviously the situation with Russia and Ukraine is going to shape foreign affairs and global affairs for a while now. And whether Justin Trudeau is prime minister for another term after this one, or whether the next leader of the Conservative Party becomes the prime minister, they will have to deal with countries like Russia, and like other countries who, for example, there's countries who voted to not condemn Russia's actions at the United Nations. The next prime minister, or Prime Minister Trudeau, if he's elected again, will have to deal with those countries becoming increasingly aggressive. How do you think, again, whether or not Justin Trudeau stays on as prime minister for another term, or whether or not the new leader of the Conservative Party becomes prime minister, how do you think they should go about managing foreign affairs and global affairs, Steph?
One thing, I mean, just to sort of to join the two, Pierre Poilievre launched his campaign. He's a message of freedom. It was all about freedom, freedom, freedom. Have you heard him say a word about freedom for Ukraine?
Right, no.
Right? No, he pivoted right towards oil and gas. And, that's a fair row for the Conservatives to hoe, but I found that very interesting. Because candidates in this race cannot afford to be one-trick ponies. If they want to be prime minister, they better be prepared to have answers on a lot of things. And this current geopolitical situation is a big one, because it will have repercussions that will, I think far outlast the actual conflict itself. The power of sanctions would be a great one. Are they going to work? Are they not? Do they maintain usefulness as a deterrent on the world stage? If NATO engages and we get into an actual war, like a full-blown European Western conflict with Russia, that's not going to end in 2 days, So I think that at least for the Conservative leadership candidates, they're going to have to sit back and have a think. Foreign policy is often a strong point for them. They are often perceived as being much stronger on that file than the Liberals are. This might be one place where Stephen Harper's legacy helps them in that respect. But I think, maybe I'm overstating it, but the recalibration of the world order seems to be underway right now, and that's no small potatoes. And I know that for the Conservatives, some of the camps are really trying to position this leadership race as about economics and about gas prices and groceries. And those really matter to everyday Canadians. They do. They should not be discounted. But you have to step it up a bit and consider Canada's place in the world and how you would lead in that context. And whether Justin Trudeau lives to fight another day, or this becomes Chrystia Freeland's road to hoe. I mean, even that, right? If you're looking at the next Liberal leadership race, how are you going to go up against Chrystia Freeland and what she has managed to achieve on behalf of the world in Ukraine? So that will be an interesting internal political fight for the Liberals, or they just let her take the win and move it forward. I don't know.
And Tim, as a final question, I mean, Steph mentioned it a little bit in terms of Chrystia Freeland, whether it's Chrystia Freeland, Justin Trudeau, or the next Conservative leader after this parliament who becomes prime minister. I mean, for example, Prime Minister Trudeau right now is on a trip in Europe. He's in Latvia, I believe, and today was in the United Kingdom, I believe, where he had a meeting with Mark Rutte and Boris Johnson. I mean, looking at, I guess, the field of Conservative leadership candidates, right now only Pierre Poilievre's there, but how do you think, trips like the one that Justin Trudeau is taking right now may change should someone like Pierre Poilievre get elected, or whether or not it's someone else, or whether it's Chrystia Freeland?
Well, I think what will become a ballot question in the Conservative leadership race, and I think this is the one Mr. Charest would like to have, is, do you want experienced leadership? Because of all the people we're talking about today, Mr. Charest, for good or for bad, can certainly argue that he has experience and seasoning, both as a premier, as a former deputy prime minister, as a business leader, and he's been part of some of the bigger deals that have been done globally in different capacities. And I think Wyatt, people will look at leadership too, and look at what's happening in the world and look for potentially a return to the more seasoned and refined leader. God forbid the return of elites. Now Pierre Poilievre is going to run hard against that. The only other thing I would add, or two things I would add, don't forget Mark Carney in the Liberal equation, because he can certainly argue that he's a seasoned global leader and has the bona fides there. The other thing I would say, and Steph mentioned a key policy area, economic policy and energy policy. Whoa, I was shocked today to see the Prime Minister talk about they may increase military spending. So if there's a broader public policy debate that's going to happen about military investment, energy resurgence and energy positioning, and fiscal freedom, as Pierre Poilievre styles it, at least on the surface, the Conservatives will think that has the potential to favor them against an incumbent government that, whenever the next election comes, will have been in power for 7 or 8 years. So lots of fascinating things to watch for.
Okay, Steph Levitz and Tim Powers, thank you both so much for joining me to discuss some of the latest in the Conservative leadership race and Russia and Ukraine. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.